Okay, let's dive right in. Picture this. You're handed the keys to a country, and your job is to build a modern economy, basically from scratch. So where do you even start? Do you try to build everything up all at once? Or do you put all your chips on a few key industries and hope they pull everything else along? This isn't just a thought experiment. It's a huge debate that has shaped how nations have grown for decades. At the heart of it all is this really simple but massive question. How does a nation actually escape poverty? Now, the question might be simple, but the answers, well, they're anything but. For years, economists have been split, offering two very powerful and pretty much opposing paths to prosperity.
And really, the whole debate boils down to this choice right here. On one side, you have the idea that a country should lift all parts of its economy up at the same time. You know, like a perfectly balanced, synchronized orchestra. On the other side, you've got the strategy of pushing certain key industries way ahead, creating a deliberate imbalance that forces the rest of the economy to catch up. It's a fundamental choice. Do you want harmony or do you want disequilibrium?
So, here's our game plan. We're going to start by exploring Path A, which is all about balanced growth and its big push theories. Then, we'll flip the script and look at the total opposite approach, unbalanced growth. And finally, we'll put these two paths side by side to see what the big takeaway is.
All right, let's jump into Path A, balanced growth. This idea, really pushed by economists like Ragnar Nurkse, makes a pretty compelling case. It says that for an economy to really get going, all of its different parts have to move forward together in perfect lockstep.
So what does balanced growth actually mean? Well, the folks who backed this idea said the biggest thing holding poor countries back was a lack of demand. So their solution was super ambitious: develop every sector of the economy. We're talking agriculture, industry, services, all at the exact same time. The whole goal is to create this perfect equilibrium where everyone's income, their spending, and all the new investment are all rising together in harmony.
And why was this simultaneous growth so incredibly important to them? Well, according to Ragnar Nurkse, it's the only way to break out of what he famously called the vicious circle of poverty, a nasty trap that just keeps poor countries poor.
So here's how this trap works on the demand side. It all starts with low income. When people don't have much money, the market for, well, anything stays tiny. And with a tiny market, why would any business bother to invest? No incentive, right? So without that investment, productivity stays low, which of course leads right back to, you guessed it, low income. It's a cycle that just feeds itself over and over again.
And it's not just on the demand side. There's a parallel trap happening on the supply side, too. Again, you start with low income. That means people can't save much. Low savings leads to low capital formation, which is just a fancy way of saying there's no money to build new factories or buy new machines. And that lack of capital means low productivity, which locks in the low income. But Nurkse did see a glimmer of hope. He pointed to what he called concealed saving potential. He was basically talking about disguised unemployment. Think of surplus workers on a farm who aren't really adding much. The idea was, if you could move those workers into new industries, you could generate savings and build capital without hurting your food production.
Okay, so if a country is stuck in these terrible cycles, how in the world does it get out? The balanced growth thinkers had a very clear answer. You need a massive, coordinated effort. And that brings us to what are known as the big push theories.
The big push theory, which was first laid out by Paul Rosenstein Rodan, argues that little, piecemeal investments are just doomed to fail. To break what he called the coordination failure problem, a country needs a gigantic, all-at-once investment across tons of different industries. This creates what economists call external economies, basically positive spillover effects. So when a new steel industry pops up, it makes it way cheaper for, say, a car industry to get started, and so on.
Rodan said this big push was absolutely necessary because of four key obstacles, or indivisibilities. First, you've got production. Think about infrastructure, like power plants or railroads. You can't just build half a railroad, right? They have a minimum scale. Second, demand. If you open a shoe factory, the workers in that factory can't buy all the shoes themselves. You need broad demand from lots of people in lots of industries. Third, savings. You can't fund a massive industrialization project from tiny individual savings accounts. It's just not going to happen. And finally, there are psychological indivisibilities. You have to break that deep-seated mindset that things will never change.
Leibenstein had another way of looking at this. He saw development as a kind of battle between two opposing forces. On one side, you have stimulants, like big investments, that create more income. And on the other side, you have shocks, like rapid population growth, that actually push down the average income per person.
Leibenstein's logic here is really clear when you look at it. If your investment is too small, any new income it creates just gets gobbled up by a growing population. You're basically running just to stand still. So, to actually break free and get real growth, your investment stimulant has to be big enough, a critical minimum effort, to overpower that population shock. Only then does your income per person actually start to climb.
In building right on that idea, R. Nelson described what he called the low-level equilibrium trap. He noticed that in really poor societies, a little bit of extra income often leads to a higher birth rate or lower death rate, which means the population grows and just cancels out that income gain. You end up right back where you started. To escape this trap, your income has to grow way faster than your population.
But let's be real, this whole big push thing requires a staggering amount of money and perfect coordination. A lot of critics looked at that and said, that's just not realistic for a developing country. And that led to a completely different way of thinking. What if the best path forward isn't perfect balance, but deliberate imbalance? And that brings us to Path B, the theory of unbalanced growth, championed by Albert O. Hirschman.
This one quote from Hirschman really says it all. For him, development wasn't some smooth, calm process. No way. It was messy. It was a dynamic, chaotic chain of disruptions. He believed that growth happens because things are out of whack, because it forces the economy to constantly adapt and solve new problems.
So the strategy here is basically forget trying to do everything at once. Instead, you take your limited money and you pour it into a few key, strategic sectors. This intentionally creates bottlenecks and shortages elsewhere. And that might sound bad, but in this theory, it's actually a good thing. Those shortages act like giant flashing signs for other investors, showing them exactly where the next big opportunity is.
Hirschman breaks down investment into two key types that create this engine of growth. First, you have social overhead capital, or SOC. Think of this as the basics: roads, ports, power grids, usually stuff the government builds. This is pressure relieving. It makes it easier and cheaper for businesses to get started. Then, you have directly productive activities, or DPA. This is the private sector stuff, like building a new factory. This is pressure creating, because that new factory suddenly needs more electricity and better roads to ship its goods. And that tension is what drives everything. You build a road, SOC, which encourages a factory, DPA, which then demands a bigger power plant, SOC, and on it goes.
So after going down both of these paths, we're left with this really fundamental choice. Should an economy aim for the calm of perfect harmony, or should it embrace the creative chaos of disequilibrium? Let's wrap this up with the final takeaway.
So here's the core conflict in a nutshell. Balanced growth says you got to develop all sectors at the same time. The goal is equilibrium, and it requires a massive, big push to solve those demand-side problems. Unbalanced growth says, no way. Develop key sectors one after another, using disequilibrium as your engine. It requires a more focused, strategic nudge to create powerful connections, like a new steel mill that creates demand for iron ore, which is a backward linkage, and also supplies cheap steel to car makers, which is a forward linkage. It's all about pulling the rest of the economy along for the ride.
And that really brings us to the final question I want to leave you with. In the real world, where countries have limited money, limited time, and limited political power, which of these paths actually makes more sense? Is the huge coordinated big push even possible? Or is the more targeted strategic nudge of unbalanced growth the smarter, more practical way to build a future? That's the great debate, and it's one that's still shaping our world today.